So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to my talk, Into the Fog, the Returns of ICEFOG APT. So, who am I? My name is Shen. I'm from Taiwan, so this is a Chinese name. I know this is very hard to remember, so you can just call me Ashley. I'm currently a senior researcher working in FireEye, intelligence collections, and the research team. And in my spare time, I like to join community events. So I'm also the co-founder of a community called Hikang Girls. This is a security community in Taiwan supporting women to join the cybersecurity industry. And also, I'm currently serve in some review board of several conferences. And also, this is my first time in Poland and first time in confidence. Come on, show some support. Thank you. So how does this research get started? The story starts from our day-to-day job as a researcher, which is reading tweets. And it's now a source of intelligence that we call tweetel. And one day, one of the tweets caught my attention. This is the Clear Skies Twitter account. They share a sample suspected targeting Kazakhstan. And the samples is an exploit document which embedded a decoy with a thing with Winter Olympic content. And before I saw this tweet, I was also analyzing these samples, and I have some concern about the attribution of these samples, which you will understand why if you don't leave me until the end. And then I saw Brian, who is a great researcher, but I never know how to pronounce his last name, mention the same concern as me. He said, I wouldn't be too quick to call this ICEFOG, the group. There are potentially multiple groups using this based on different region, language, and responsibility. So I know now you must be wondering, what is ICEFOG? What are you talking about? So here's a little bit background about ICEFOG. In 2013, Kaspersky published a comprehensive report about a targeted attack campaign leverage a malware to target US, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. The malware is named ICEFOG. It is using the word observed in the CNC domains, and it is also has another name named Fukoba. It's probably named by Japanese, I think. The campaign detail in the report was took place between 2011 and 2013, and ever since after the report published, now we frequently see people refer to ICEFOG as a malware, sometimes as a report, but sometimes also refer it as a group. However, is it really a group? Here's the problem. If you try to search on Google about ICEFOG, you will find the latest public report on ICEFOG was in 2013 and 2014. And after the report published by Kaspersky, there's no new report and research detail any new campaigns about this, about the new campaign in these 5 years. And of course, there are a few of tweets or samples analysis on the ICEFOG malware. There aren't any campaign tracking, and they mostly just attribute these new samples to the old group that hold the campaigns in 2013. But are they really from the same groups or attacker? The reason why I'm asking is because the latest samples we observe are targeting completely different countries and regions. Also, there are some changes to the malware, and the techniques have been used in the attacks are changed. Therefore, I decided to conduct a deep analysis research on the ICEFOG campaigns and try to figure out what happened in these 5 years and what has been changed and unchanged. And are these the new samples came from the same attackers in 2013, or they are new attackers using these tools nowadays? So now I know some of you might wondering, why do I care about which attackers are using this malware? And if you have ever participated in any threat intelligence talk, you might be heard of this famous quote from Sun Tzu. And he talked about know your enemy and know yourself, then you will always beat victory. But now I figured out a better way to describe it. If you have watched Pokemon, which I would be surprised if you haven't, you will know what Ash do when he met a new Pokemon for the first time. He would take out the Pokédex to understand what the capability of this Pokemon has and pick up the right Pokemon to fight battle. This is why we should understand the Pokemon I mean the actor, the attacker that we are facing. So we will know what are they targeting and what kind of tools, what kind of defense methods should I use to face this Pokemon, I mean the actor. So I think I don't need to explain more for this concept if you understand the functions of Pokédex. It is the same as the same contrast concept of the threat intelligence. So now, how do I start the research? Because I want to understand what has changed between these 5 years and what has been changed. I need to collect data to do the analysis, and these data are the samples deployed in the attacks. And I need as much as samples as I can. It is not a secret that every malware researchers are doing hunting on the public file scanning service. And aside from public file scanning service, in file we also have the appliance that do the detections. So there's also one of the sample sources. And for hunting samples, there are several characteristics can be used for hunting, including the strings in the malware, which sounds pretty simple, but it's usually very effective. Also, the malware function usually need to reverse the malware and get the unique functions. And sometimes malware developer, they will include some debug informations in the malware that can also use for hunting. And besides hunting the characteristic of the malware itself, we also try to hunt for the exploit template. And there are some pitfalls with this method, which I will explain it later. And hunting is always a cycle. With the samples we got from hunting, we extract the IOC, and then we can pivot on the CNC to see if we can find more samples. So ICEFOG is kind of special because it has 8 kind of different variants, which are disclosed before 2014. For each type, there are some difference between the communication method. The most common variants are the type 1 and the type NG variants. ICEFOG not only has the Windows-based, it also has the Mac OS version and the Java version. The Mac OS version was the only variants that are public available. It has been also distributed in some foreign, Chinese form in 2013. However, when we did some samples, when we defined some samples during hunting, of the Mac version, they don't look like the actual sample that deploy in the attack because the CNC server are mostly the default setting or are the private IP. So we don't think, so by now we didn't observe any actual Mac OS version sample using the actual attack. And all these ICEFOG variants have the very basic backdoor functions supported, including upload, download, executing commands, and the code command is for loading a specific file. And this slide is showing some unique strings in some ICEFOG variants that can be used for hunting. So in the very early old ICEFOG samples, they didn't do any obfuscated to the string. So you can see from the screenshot there, it's very obvious. This is the traffic patterns, including some victims' information, IP, user, directly, assistant directory, language. This information will be sent to the CNC server. And also, the XOR keys is one of the unique string that can be used for hunting. And for the old ICEFOG malware, because it can communicate with the CNC server with the email account, so you can easily find some special string about the email in the malware. And also for type 2, because it communicates with some ASP.NET script, so you can see this kind of string in the malware too. But the most recognizable strings in this malware, and this is actually using this string, this is how I found a new malware, is the string in the ICEFOG type 1. There's a very typical string of traffic pattern, which is the file path and file names. This is a very typical traffic patterns of ICEFOG. And while in the later variants, that a lot of these strings has been changed because it's easy to change, but this traffic pattern didn't change. So for hunting, some of the methods used for encryptions are pretty helpful. In most of the variants, there are functions to encrypt data transferred to CNC server, and this encryption usually involves unique keys and logic. For example, you can see the XOR key and function in this screenshot from ICEFOG NG and OS, also the OSX version, and also the type 1. So in 2018, we start to observe attacker to the advantage of the Microsoft Document Exploitation 2017-11882 to deploy the ICEFOG payload. And we noticed that most of the ICEFOG samples was dropped by the Shen exploit template, which has the same metadata and use the same shellcode to drop the malware. When user open the exploit document, an encoded dropper will be dropped into the temp folder, and upon exploitation, the shellcode will be executed and decode the encoded dropper, and the dropper will drop the final payload. The dropper usually contains the final payload, but it's not always ICEFOG. I will explain it later. There are two different ways that we can hunt for these exploit document samples. One is to recognize the embedded object dimensions that typically share among the exploit template. Another method is to hunt for the shellcode decode routine that used in the exploit template. There's a research from Anomalist. They have a great analysis on this exploit template. So if you are interested, you can try to look at this research. And however, this hunting method is a pitfall need to be noticed because with further research, we realized that although this template is not public available and quite unique, this is actually shared amongst some different attacker groups, including APT40, Kahneman's team, also known as Goblin Panda, and also the ICEFOG operator. In this table, I list some samples that we observed that are used by different attacker groups, but they are all the same template. For example, the sample used by APT40, they usually drop big and malware and usually target the US. And the samples used by Kahneman's team usually drop 10 fund and targets VNS mostly. So the reason why we think they are used by different attacker groups is because this template usually drop different kinds of malware and target totally different region. And the infrastructure connected by the malware is totally completely different, couldn't be connected. And the TTP in other samples is also somehow different. So this is why we think that this template is actually shared by different attacker groups. But this is a pitfall for attribution because I have seen some blog that analyze some ICEFOG sample and say, oh, this is Kahneman's team. But no, this is actually two different groups. So attributing based on just only the sample is kind of dangerous. So with the above-mentioned hunting method, in addition to the no ICEFOG variants, I was able to find two new variants which appears after 2014 and also being deployed in the campaign between 2014 and 2019. These two variants are similar in terms of the functionality. However, they use different communication protocol to call back to CNC server. Because these two variants are newly discovered, so it didn't have a time name, so I just give it a time name. One is called ICEFOG-P and one is called ICEFOG-M. And ICEFOG-P was first observed in 2014, and M is the latest, observed in 2018. Also, the ICEFOG-M variant has become fileless. It is existing as a shellcode. So what's new in this ICEFOG-P? Comparing with the old ICEFOG samples, this variant supports more commands that make it more complete backdoor. It now supports commands to create new directly, terminate current thread, text screenshot, send keylog data, rename files, etc. The main function is actually very easy to locate when you are doing reversing because it's very gently remind you that this is the main function with the output depot string. And also in the ICEFOG-P variant, there's a where logic that would, before entering the main function, it will try to determine the current date time and see if this is before May 5th, 2013. Why do I say this is weird? Because the earliest ICEFOG-P sample was discovered in 2014, but the date was in 2013. So my hypothesis is probably this is a way in 2014 they tried to identify the analysis environment or anti-sandbox. And even in the newer, in 2018, they didn't change this because they just copied the old code and then didn't modify it. The new ICEFOG variants also add a lot of information into the traffic sent over to CNC server. It includes the OS version, CPU data, physical memory, hard disk, CD-ROM, disk space, and these are apparently for attacker to filter out the analysis environment. Another new capability added to the new variants is the function to collect Windows and browser credentials. For browser, it supports Firefox and Chrome. The code in these functions are apparently copied from the open source code project. For dumping Windows password, it just used the code from fqdump project. And for the functions to collect Firefox credentials, it used the code downloaded from the website, and then security exploded. This code needs to load an external SQLite 3 library to query the password. So some of the ICEFOG variants will embed some SQLite 3 functions in the library. In the binary, I mean. And one of the interesting features support in the new variants is the functions to monitor specific folder. The command disk list, it will save a directory list into a file. And then after it saves the list, there is another function that will monitor the directory change with the API read directory change, and then save the logs into another file. And the log will be saved into this format, and then when attacker gives the command disk log, the backdoor will send the log data to CNC server with this specific traffic pattern, which mimic as a JPG file. The second ICEFOG variant, ICEFOG-M, basically support the same functionality as ICEFOG-P. The difference is it encrypt the traffic by communicate with CNC through HTTPS protocol. And the payload becomes fileless. The payload is usually encrypted and write into the register key created by a shortcode in exploit document. It is usually deployed with a customized loader, which will query the register key and decree and run the payload in memory. To reduce the size of the malware, they have an external SQLite 3 library, which will drop by the dropper, and then the shortcode will load this library during execution. So after collecting all these samples, let's look at the PDB string of this malware. We constantly observe a name JD shows up in the old sample ICEFOG type 1 and type 2 before 2013. So it seems like JD is probably a developer, and there's also another user named YoungZC. But after 2013, all the ICEFOG-P variants has very different PDB string, and many other names like Apple, Shen, showing the other showing this variant. So it probably indicates that after 2013, there are more developers are maintaining this malware. To better understand the uses of each variant, I analyzed the compile timestamp of the collected samples. The ICEFOG-M variant is fileless shortcode, so the compile timestamp is extracted from the loader. And from this graph, we can see that basically after 2014, attackers seems to abandon all the ICEFOG old variants, including the old one, type 1, type 2, and NG, all disappear after 2014. And start from 2014, they switch completely to the ICEFOG-P variants. And in 2018, they start to use the ICEFOG-M variant. And this graph shows the compile timestamp distribution for each year. As you can see, the sample numbers are relatively high between 2011 and 2013. And interestingly, after Kaspersky published their report in September 2019, in the next few months, which is the last quarter of 2013, we didn't observe any samples compiled in this period. And in 2014, we start to observe a small amount of sample, but the sample number is still dramatically drop. And 2015, it started to grow a little bit, 16 grow a little bit, but we couldn't find any samples compiled in 2017 with unknown reasons. Then in 2018, the numbers start to increase again, and it's more than 2016. So this graph gives us a brief image on the number of attack leverage ICEFOG in each year. However, the number could be affected by several factors. For example, the same compile timestamp shared with the malware dropper or wrapper. Also, sometimes attacker might use the sample compile before in the new campaign. So to determine the actual sample number deployed in each year, we need to consider more timestamps. So how do we determine the timestamp of each samples? As I mentioned, it would not be just by the compiled timestamp of the binary. In fact, we need to consider multiple factors, including the CNC passive DNF timestamp, the domain creation date, the dropper compile timestamp, and exploit document timestamp, and sometimes also the decoy file timestamp. Also, sometimes in PDB string, there will be a date that attacker left. Below is one of the examples showing why we shouldn't just judge by the compile timestamp. So this sample is interesting because the oldest timestamp is in 2014. The exploit document was less safe on 2014. However, the sample itself is compiled in 2016. But then the sample was observed in 2017, and also the CNC passive DNS shows that the domain was resolved to the server in 2017. Most importantly, the timestamp in the decoy file dropped by the samples was in 2017. With all this information, we determined that these samples were most possibly deployed in 2017. So in this graph, we add our own judgment to the sample distribution timeframe, and this graph is very similar to the previous one, but as you can see, there are actually some samples deployed in 2017, and the trend of the sample number is still growing. Note that for 2019, we only collect the samples before May this year. So after collecting all the samples, what's the next step? Because my goal is try to have a clear pictures of the campaigns in these 5 years. I need to figure out the relationship between each sample. So I start to do the infrastructure clustering to identify the campaign. Because attacker normally, when they do conduct a campaign, they will use the domains and IP address that can be correlated. And this is how we try to do the clustering. To connect the dots, I leverage the passive DNS data. The tool I use in this part of the research is mainly Meltingo. For those who are not familiar with this tool, Meltingo is an interactive data mining tool that renders directed graph for link analysis. Because the interactive interface is actually look like this. So when I found the samples, I found the CNC, and then I put the node into this graph, and then there are some transforms that will automatically find the passive DNS data, and then create a node and create a link for me. And this is how I do the clustering and find the connection between each sample. It sounds pretty intuitive, but actually there are some difficulties for performing this analysis. For example, one of the challenge is incomplete passive DNS data. Well, there are a lot of passive DNS database, but none of them can be like completely like 100% guarantee that it's complete data. And another challenge is after the report published in 2013, attacker might have changed the exposed infrastructure entirely, so no connections can be found. And the next problem is the one that brings me most of the headaches, which are the sinkhole. There are a lot of sinkholes that are not flagged in any of the database. So when I do the pivoting, when I try to do the connections, I will connect to a sinkhole that actually connects to tons of complaint, and then I figure out, oh, this is actually the sinkhole that I need to filter out. And also the parking IP address, when you create a domains from maybe a hosting service provider, they will first, before actually assigned to you, they will first park it as an IP address. So on that IP address, you will see a lot of passive DNS records. They include tons of domain, but they are actually just parking there. So this is the kind of problem that I have when I do the infrastructure clustering. And I got all the CNC infrastructure from 200 samples. I collected samples compiled between 2011 and 2018, and put them all in the graph and pivoting the passive DNS. And this is quite a time-consuming work, but one eternity later, I got this. On the blue circle shows the infrastructure that considered as a cluster. There are totally 9 clusters identified after analysis. And in the middle, you will see the orange circle. These are all the sinkhole IP and the parking IP that's being filtered out. And after all the analysis, we finally has a timeline of each cluster. And by examining the samples in each cluster, I try to further determine the targets of each campaigns. And it is done by determining the decoy content, the submission locations, and our internal detection locations. So from this timeline, you can see from 2014 to 2019, there are 9 campaigns involved ICEFOG. All these campaigns had not been revealed in any public previous research before. The box in gray color are smaller cluster that only have a few samples observed. You can see some samples they were targeting Kazakhstan, Russia, Tajikistan. I can never pronounce this word well. And there are more targeted countries in the larger campaigns. Due to the limited time, I won't be able to introduce all these campaigns. I will introduce some interesting and large campaigns in the following slides. The first incident I'm introducing is an attack targeting an agriculture company in Europe. This is actually a sample found in the IR case that we investigate in 2015. We found a 64-bit ICEFOG P variant in the compromised environment, and the investigations found that the earliest intrusion was back in 2011. However, the attacker did not use ICEFOG to get the initial access. According to the log, the attacker actually used a malware called Sogu, also called PlugX, and another malware called FunRun to gain initial access. Also, we found a malware called Viceroy. This is a backdoor that only have been observed used by a group called APT9. And although we eventually attribute this incident to APT9, we also found the samples that are connected to APT10's infrastructure. So this is interesting because these targets has been targeted by multiple groups at the same time. And the ICEFOG backdoor found at the skin was a highly customized version. We think these samples was used as a post-exploitation tools because the malware includes some code that leverage as a second stage backdoor. Upon execution, the malware will check the existence of a file, and then it will access if the file is not presented. We did not find this file in the environment, so we are not sure what it is for. When the file is not presented, it will create a mutex with the key shown in the screenshot there, and then it will create a new thread to communicate with CNC server. And this ICEFOG is also the only variant that we observe are loading external files for the CNC configuration. So upon executing, it will try to locate 2 files and then see if this file under the Windows directory or not. And then if yes, it was read the encoded configuration CNC domain from the file. In 2015, there is also another campaign that I named it Top News because the campaign registered a lot of CNC domain mimicking as a news website. Below, you can see some samples and the CNC domains that connects to. Some of the samples were delivered by spear phishing email sent to the targets in Mongolia and Russia. Based on the email receiver and the lure in the samples, the targets are suspected in the government, finance, and media sector. The ICEFOG variant used in these campaigns are all ICEFOG P variants, and we found that some samples include some suspected campaign code inside the binary. Some indicate probably the date of the attack, and some other are probably just the code for the campaign. Most of the ICEFOG payloads are dropped by the RAR self-extracting archive with a substituted icon, like the one shows in the slide. And the self-extracting files will drop the malware and the decoy. And the screenshot in the right shows one of the decoy we found. It is in Mongolian, and according to Google Translate, it means special office or jurisdiction. One of the ICEFOG connects to the CNC domain delnewsup.net, and this domain has 13 subdomains. Pivoting these subdomains, we found some other malwares connected to the same infrastructure. Below is the table that we found with the malware family that connects to the subdomain of this domain. And you can see that these domains include, again, Sogu, PlugX malware, the Temfun malware, also the FunRun malware. So apparently, ICEFOG is not the only tool used by this attacker. So pivoting the domain with past DNS, we found many other domains that are also using the same news things, like the Micro News, Google News, Sport News. And these domains were all registered with the same email address from the same registrant. This email address is actually a jackpot because it is an email that we tracked for a long time, belonged to an espionage campaign called Roaming Tiger. So Roaming Tiger was originally an espionage campaign discovered by ESET in 2014, and the campaign targets high-profile organizations in Russia and former Soviet Union countries, including Belarus, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. And the group mostly use Sogu, PlugX, which is which is also another tool shared by many Chinese origins espionage group. And before this research, we never know Roaming Tiger is also using ICEFOG malware, but now we know they leverage ICEFOG to target Mongolia and Russia. The next campaign is in 2016, which I call the APT campaign. And this campaign involved a lot of samples, and one of them was targeting Kazakhstan. And it was reported in the KZ Search blog in September 2015. This samples is an Office spreadsheet with embedded malicious macro to drop a RAR self-extracting dropper. It will further drop an ICEFOG P variant. And in the screenshot at the right corner, you can see that's the decoy file inside this malicious macro document, because macro is usually disabled by default. So the lure is trying to give a warning to the user and lure them to enable the macro function. In this table, it shows in the right, you can see the samples we found in these campaigns and see why I named this campaign APT, because all the samples we found in this campaign has this PDB string with a username APT. And you can also see the CNC domains that are pivoting to an IP address. And this IP address actually have another domain, which is Tajikistan travel dynamic.dns, and this is suspected another domain used by the attacker. The next campaign took place in 2018. I call it Waterfight campaign because the campaign target water source provider, but also banks and government. Based on the lure and language, the target country including Turkey, India, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. The samples observed in these campaigns are dropped by the CV 2017-1182 exploit template that we mentioned before in the slide previous show, and this is shared amongst Chinese targeted attack groups. And this is the screenshot of the decoy file found in the samples of this campaign. Does this look familiar to you? This is actually the decoy file I showed in the first slides in the tweet by Clear Sky. And this decoy is showing the pictures of a Russian Winter Olympic skater. And the screenshot on the right is another decoy we found related about the service level agreements with India government. The table is showing the ICEFOG samples dropped by the exploit document, and these are all ICEFOG P variants. And you can see that these samples are all compiled in the short periods, around February 23rd and February 24th. And on February 23rd, in a short time, it compiles a lot of samples. So the main campaign probably took place on that day. And about then, one of the CNC domain is this one. I don't know how to use this. The UZ water source, dynamic the DNS.net. This is dropped from samples that I showed in previous slide. This exploit document, which has the name AGAT. So actually, AGAT is a water source company in Uzbekistan. And then apparently, this campaign is targeting the water source company a lot. And in 2018, there's another large campaign that I called it PH Night campaign. This first observations was from a detections on our appliance. We detect the ICEFOG traffic come out from the Philippines. And the traffic shows in this box. You can see the CNC server. And remember this special traffic pattern that belonged to ICEFOG. And searching these CNC domains on VirusTotal, we found two other URL with also the ICEFOG traffic pattern, which is logged on July and October 2018. So it means that the attack was probably still ongoing at that time. And investigating the CNC domain, we found two other subdomains, and one of the subdomains is connected by another backdoor called NCMD samples, which also called Huharini and Sarhus backdoor. And this backdoor has been observed used by APT-15, a Chinese espionage group also called Social Network Team. Below is the samples information. This is interesting because the NCMD is a malware that we only observed used in the campaign attributed to APT-15. And APT-15 had long history targeting Philippines. So what are the domains found in the campaign, in this campaign infrastructure cluster? Through the passive DNS, we found a lot of domains that shows their attackers' interest in Philippines. You can see there are a lot of domains related to Philippines, and also PLDT is actually a telecom company in Philippines, and also PNOC is actually an oil energy company in Philippines. So from this connected infrastructure, we found more malware connected to them. We discovered more NCMD samples they are connected to the correlated infrastructure. In addition, we found one Mirage backdoor connected to the domain suspected mimicking the telecommunication companies. So Mirage backdoor is another backdoor which associated with APT-15. Combining all this discovery information, all the discovered information, the malware, the techniques, and the target scope, we think this campaign is conducted by APT-15. This is another new discovery because we did not know if APT-15 is also using the ICEFOG samples. The last campaign is discovered this year. I call it Skyline campaign. This campaign is likely target Turkey and Kazakhstan based on the sample submission country. This campaigns also leverage the exploit CVE 2017-1182 template and to drop the ICEFOG malware. From the timestamp in this exploit document, the campaign is likely start from 2018. The ICEFOG variants observed in this campaign is the latest variants, the ICEFOG N type, and which is the fileless payload. Although the samples in this campaign are using the Shen exploit, the way it launched the payload is different. In previous campaign, the exploit document would drop an encoded dropper that contained the payload. However, in this case, the dropper only contains a customized loader. The shellcode in this exploit document not only drops the dropper, but also it will write the encrypted ICEFOG payload into the registry key. And when the customized loader that dropped by the dropper load, it will try to read the register key and then decrypt the payload and execute in memory. The table in this slide is showing the loader we observed in this campaign and the CNC connected by the payloads. Interestingly, two of the domains look like a Punicode domain, but when I try to convert it, one of it can be successfully converted, but that to Chinese word doesn't mean anything. Another one cannot be converted at all. So I think it is just the domain trying to forge as a Punicode domain. I don't know why the attacker do this. Not sure if this is a way to bypass the detection or not, but this is kind of a new trick they used in the recent attack. And the traffic pattern is very similar with the ICEFOG P variants. However, in one case, we observed the traffic at a group ID inside the traffic pattern. And this is suspected a representative of the campaign. And also, the variants still preserve the weird logic to identify the system date, but it changed from the May 5th to the January 1st. I don't see what's the point of doing this, but it just changed. So now we already know what happened between these 5 years. We found all these campaigns that has their own different infrastructure. Now let's solve the next questions. How do we attribute this campaign? In our previous slide, we have mentioned some campaigns that can be linked to some non-attacker groups, including the top news. It can be linked to the roaming tiger groups via the CNC infrastructure, registering email, also the Shen target scope and TTP. And the attack targets the agriculture company in Europe was attributed to APT 9. Although this is considered as a weak link because we only found the samples in the environment, but we are not sure it's used by the Shen attacker groups. But this is the only link we found for this campaign. And another one is the APT 15 behind the campaign that targets Philippines based on the malware and CNC overlap and the targets overlap. So now we have figured out some of the attacker groups who were using ICEFOG secretly. This group has been tracked for several years, so we have the active profile in our hands. And as you can see from the profile, these groups have different target scope, they have different tool sets, they have different interested sectors. If your organization belongs to any of the interstate sector in the targeted country, then you should be aware of the attacks from these groups and understand the tools that are used by this attacker group in their campaigns. And also, of course, ICEFOG is one of them. And what about the other campaigns that haven't been attributed? Are they from the same attacker groups, or are they connected with this no attacker group? Let's try to figure it out. So let's start to connect the dots. By pivoting to infrastructure using each campaign, I found several connections between them. Let's start from the latest campaign, Skyline. And this is the sample and the connected infrastructure we found in the Skyline campaign. This domain is connected to an IP that actually connects to the domain used in the Waterfight campaign. And one of the domains is also observed in the campaign targeting Tajikistan. Sorry, it's showing slower. And it also linked to the domains connected by a Sogu malware. So remember this Eagle of Tajik domain. Let's see the next slide. So start from this Eagle of Tajik domains. It has a passive DNS IP that actually connects to the APT campaign. This IP address is connected directly by an ICEFOG malware in the APT campaign. And this IP also resolved by the domain used in the same campaigns in the water fight campaign. And also, it further linked to another Sogo malware and another Tajik domain, which is the Tajik travel dynamic.net. And from this infrastructure, it is further linked to the UZ water source dynamic.net, which is also in the water fight campaign. And from this infrastructure, it can be linked to a large campaigns that use the Sogo and Quick Help, another backdoor used by Chinese espionage group. And this campaign is targeting Kazakhstan in 2015. I know all these connections are like a mess, so let's look at the next graph. This graph shows all the connections between this campaign, and we can see that all these campaigns can be connected by the CNC infrastructure. Now we know all these campaigns are likely from the same attacker groups. The only connection between this large cluster of the campaign with the existing attackers is one of the samples that share between Roaming Tiger campaign with the campaign targets Tajikistan is the same PDB stream. Actually, the target scope of this cluster is very similar to the targets of Roaming Tiger. However, without further overlapping on the infrastructure, currently we still track it separately. So now, here's the new attacker groups profiles that we are still tracking the link to the Roaming Tiger. So this group now does not have an official name yet. However, what we know is that this group is at least active since 2014, and their method of delivering malware is using spear phishing email, along with exploit document, malicious macro files, and self-extracting file. They target Russia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkey. And they also use not only ICEFOG, but also Sogo and Quick Help in their campaign. This group might have some connection to Roaming Tiger groups, as I mentioned, but we need to find more connection before we can merge them or do further attribution. So here come the conclusions of this research. ICEFOG is a malware share amongst Roaming Tiger, APT15, the TAM Group A, and the suspected APT9. Share malware is a pitfall for attribution. We should not just do attribution only based on the malware. And the new actor profile, the TAM Group A, is aggressively using ICEFOG to target the above-mentioned region. And with the latest ICEFOG M variants, the file list version, the whole space detection for payloads are more difficult. So their new attacks are more difficult to discover. And because you can see that the old ICEFOG has 8 different kinds of variants, and there are 2. Now there's totally 10 different variants, which and attackers are simply continuously developing the new variants, which indicates that in the future there will probably be more attack leveraging ICEFOG in the campaign, and probably it will be shared by more attacker groups. So this is definitely a malware that the targets should be aware of. That's it. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Ashley, so much. Congratulations for this presentation.